Hello, today we are framing the roof on the 8x12 shed that we're building. There are many ways to build your roof, but I find it best and cheap is to cut rafters, build a rafter unit, and install that on the roof. There are two methods that you can do it. I'm going to show you both. One, simply by doing calculations, and the other one, it's a visual method that you don't need to do any calculations. And to start, we need to figure out what kind of roof pitch we want. Do we want a really steep roof or something more flat? The most common pitches in a shed are going to be a 412 or 912. What that means is for every 12 inches of run, you're going to have 9 inches of rise. This example has a 912 pitch.
Let's take the first rafter. To cut the first rafter, we need three measurements: the top cut, the seat cut, and the end cut. The top cut is made right in the beginning of a 2x6 board. I take my speed square and I position right where the board begins. Then you notice there's a mark called pivot. I'm gonna pivot my speed square until I see the number 9. That's because we have a 912 pitch. I then mark my top cut. Next is the seat cut. To find the seat cut, I measure across the entire wall where the rafter will sit. I then divide that by 2 because we only need half the distance for the first rafter. And in this case, we have a distance of 47.25 inches. I take the 47 inches and I divide it by 12. And that's 12 from the 912 pitch that I need. I end up with 3.93. I take that 393 and I multiply by 9 to get my rise distance. Now all I need is to find out the hypotenuse, which is the distance from the top cut to the seat cut. Per the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And for me, what that means is 47 squared plus 35 squared will equal to c squared. And to find the c, I take the square root of 3487. And now I have my distance from the top cut to the seat cut, which is the hypotenuse of 59 inches. To mark the 59 inches on the board, I do the same thing I did with the square in the beginning. I pivot the square to the number 9 and I mark it. The last mark is the end cut. This is more of a personal preference mark. For my shed, I want to have 11 inches of overhang all around. So I add 11 inches to the previous mark. And just like the first two times using the pivot point on the square, I mark my last cut. And this is what the marks look like. And now it's time to cut. My first cut is the top cut. The next is the end cut. I leave the seat cut for last. Because first, I need to measure 3.5 inches perpendicular to the seat cut mark I made it earlier. It's 3.5 inches because the thickness of a 2x4 wall that I have. I make this cut and now I have my first rafter ready. Now, if this was complicated, let's try a more visual method. Instead of doing all the math, let's take that template we had earlier and make it bigger, about 4 times bigger. But first, I mark half of the wall distance on this OSB. Then, as I said, I make a 4 times bigger template, which it is 4 feet by 36 inches height. I then snap a chalk line on the panel. I make my first cut on the 2x6 board, that's the top cut. I place the 2x6 board right on top of the chalk line. I walk over to where the board intersects with the edge of the OSB panel and I place a mark. This is my seat cut mark. And just like when we did the first cut, using the speed square, we pivot over to the number 9 and mark it. In exactly the same way as earlier, I add 11 inches for my overhang. Then I'm ready to make my cut. And just like earlier as well, we cut the seat next, and that is 3.5 inches measured perpendicular to the seat cut line. And if you have done both approaches, you can check them by laying one on top of the other. This should be the same measurements across. And now that you have two cut, we can assemble the first rafter. To assemble the first set of rafters, I laid these 2x6 boards we just cut on top of the OSB platform we're working on. I centered them as much as possible to the center line, and I use a small scrap piece of OSB to secure them together. I cut the excess off with a skill saw and move it over to the shed so we can dry fit it. When dry fitting these rafters for the first time, make sure they sit flat on the 2x4 wall. It's okay if they don't sit correctly. You can always make adjustments by cutting some material off. In my case, I needed to make adjustments because the rafters were interfering with the siding. So I notched about ½ inch on the end of the seat cut. And now that we are happy with the first rafter, let's make this a template for every other one. I aligned the rafter with my work platform so it's squared and centered with my center line. I used scrap pieces of wood to make a jig, so every time I assembled one of these rafters, it will be identical to the first one. I took apart the first one that I built, and I chose one of the rafter boards as my template to make every single one. And using that template board, I bring it over to my lumber pile and I mark the top cut of every single board. I go on to cut all of them at once and then move on to do the same thing on the end cuts. The last piece here is to cut the seat cuts. And with all the rafter boards cut, I prepare to assemble them.
Now that we have cut all of our rafters, we're gonna put it together on this jig we created. And when you do so, make sure that each rafter is on a center line so they're pretty square. So both are center. A little more, here you go. Then I cut a square 12 by 12 from plywood. That's what I'm gonna use to hold this together. So what I do is I line up here with the top. Then we're gonna screw this on with 8 screws.
So I have right here my rafters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1 against the wall. Six rafters assembled. In addition to that, I also have 2 rafters that do not have the seat cut, and these are going to be used for the front and back of the shed overhang. Time to install the rafters on top of the shed. I carry the rafters one at a time and I leave them upside down inside the shed. That's a pretty safe method so they don't fall on you and they stay out of the way. I stand up the first one and I add 2 toenails on each side of the rafter. When nailing this, make sure to keep them leveled and straight as possible. It's a good practice to tie a string on the first rafter and one on the last to ensure that all other ones are in the center.
Alright, so here's the mistake I made. The shed is 12 feet long, and if we mount a truss every 2 feet, I thought to myself I need 6 trusses. But in reality, I need 7. You start with a truss, and every 2 feet, you mount a new truss. But you don't have to worry because I have plans of this very shed in the description below. And that way you know exactly how many trusses and all the material you need for your shed. Also in the description below you can find all the materials used here today added to a shopping cart. That way you can check it out, look at it, add and remove items if you need, and also have the option to deliver to your house, saving you hours shopping around and loading materials.
I install the last rafter up and then I move on to installing the plywood on the roof. Anytime I'm working solo, I like to use mounting blocks as much as possible. I screw a bunch of scrap pieces of plywood on the end of the rafters to hold the OSB in place when I bring it up. I measure the plywood that I need for the roof, cut it to length, and bring it up to the roof. Whenever carrying the OSB, keep in mind that they do have a side that should be facing down. Plan ahead before you climb the ladder. It is very difficult flipping these pieces of plywood mid-air. I use framing nails to secure the plywood down to the rafters, and I nail them every 12 inches or so. It's time to install the overhang. I cut 6 10.5-inch blocks to make the overhang. I nail 3 on each side, about 2 feet apart. I then bring in the rafter and nail the rafter to the overhang. Then I nail the overhang to the OSB in the roof. I do the same procedure on the back of the shed. This will give me a nice 11 inches of overhead front and back of the shed.
Next, I'm gonna finish up the siding right above the doorway and also on the back. And then we're gonna throw up some shingles. If you wanna check out that video, you can find it right here. If you wanna check out the whole build, you can check it out right here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.